The four men had been traveling for 2 days, and Abraham looks up and he sees the place that he is to go to. He sees the mountain that God had told him to go to. He turns to his two servants and he says, "You all stay here. Me and the lad, who is Isaac, are going to go on our own, and we're going to go up this mountain." And Abraham takes fire in his hand, and in the other hand he takes a knife. And the two servants watch the backs of Abraham and Isaac. Isaac has the wood on his back, and they watch them depart. Before Abraham leaves, he says, "We're going to go to this mountain. We're going to go worship, and we'll be back." Open your Bibles this morning to the book of Genesis, chapter 22. Genesis, chapter 22. I want to lay a little bit of groundwork before we go back right into the text this morning. It may be a little bit since you've heard about Abraham and Isaac and Sarah and Ishmael, but I want to give you a quick review of these things. Abraham was told in Genesis chapter 12 to get out of his home country. He was told to leave Haran, leave everything he knew, and go to a country. I wonder if Abraham, what was he thinking when God told him to do these things? For what? Why should I do these things? And for what purposes will God have for me? Well, God revealed these things. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to multiply your descendants. Your descendants will be numerous. But the point is that Abraham believed God. It was accounted to him for righteousness. He did what God said. He left Haran and began to journey towards the land of promise, the land of Canaan. And he goes there and he has his life there, and he has Sarah, his wife, and they begin on this journey of following God. It's interesting when you look at Genesis chapter 12 all the way to Genesis chapter 22 that God just continues to show up in Abraham's life. Abraham is not a perfect person. Abraham and Sarah, they make mistakes, they make blunders. In fact, one of the things that I want you to think about, and it's notable in the story today, is that God had also promised not just to make their descendants numerous as those of the seashore and the stars of the sky, but also when the heir, there was supposed to be a promised son that would come through Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah began to wonder and doubt, and how is this going to come about? And there were many numerous occasions where they grappled and they wrestled with this question of how God would bring about this promised seed. And Abraham and Sarah, they took it upon themselves, and they came up with an idea that Abraham would conceive a child with their servant Hagar. And they did, and the little boy's name was Ishmael. And God told them that this is not the promise. This is not the heir of the promise. And they were in old age, and it was 100 years old. Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah was 90 when Isaac was finally born. And that is in chapter 21. And this little boy, and God said that Isaac would be the heir of promise. He would be the son of promise. And here we come now to Genesis chapter 22, and the first verse says, "Now it came to pass after these things." It is all of those things that I just told you about, that they were wandering and they were journeying and they were attempting to follow God, and they had heard the promises of God, and they had no idea how these promises would be fulfilled. And it says, "Now it came to pass after these things." Well, there's one more thing that I want to remind you of, is that in the previous chapter, God had told them to expel Ishmael from out of the house. Ishmael and Hagar were told to leave the house. You're not to be a part of this house. This is a house here that will be made up of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac. And so now they live all alone, and then God comes here in Genesis chapter 22, and 2 days earlier from where I took you from a while ago, before he goes up the mountain, 2 days before, look at the end of chapter 20, or the end of verse 1 in chapter 22, and the first thing that I want you to see today is the examination. Notice here at the end of verse 1, it says, Abraham. God comes and he says to Abraham, Abraham, he begins to speak to him once again. God shows up in Abraham's life again, and what will he say? And Abraham says, here I am. And in verse 2, he says to him, take now your son, and that's Isaac, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Well, I want you to know also, the reader knows, but Abraham does not know. Look at the beginning of verse 1. This is a test. God is testing Abraham. God is wanting to examine Abraham's faith. He is going to put Abraham's faith to the test. It is going to be something that he would like to look into the heart of Abraham and to know, is he willing to do whatever it takes to honor him? And he says in verse 2, he says, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering. He is telling Abraham to take his son, the heir of the promise, the one that they have waited on to their old age, the one who was miraculously born out of their old age. They were not biologically able to have children, but God made it to where they could. And they have Isaac, but now God is going to put Abraham to the test. Abraham doesn't know it's a test. He is just hearing these words, and take Isaac and offer him as a sacrifice. Can you imagine what in the world you would be thinking if God said, take your only son, the one who I delivered to you, the one who I gave you, the one who I said the promises would come through him, now take him and offer him as a sacrifice. Kill him and burn him like a lamb. Well, what does he do? He says, on one of the mountains which I shall tell you, in verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. I was looking at these verses very carefully over the last week, actually before last week, and I noticed something that was a little bit, it may not be odd to you, but I thought it was a little bit odd, is that they made preparations to go. He was obedient to go, but the last thing he does is he goes out and he begins to split the wood. Can you imagine what's going through Abraham's mind as he is splitting this wood? I imagine with every lift of the maul or the axe or whatever he's using to split this wood, that he is thinking about his son. And he's pondering these things that God has said and this command. How can this be? I mean, what am I doing, and why am I doing it? And why is God asking me to do these things? And then they come there on the third day after they've traveled. Abraham takes 2 of his servants with him. He has Isaac with him. Isaac's probably 10 years old, 12 years old. Abraham is probably 110, 112 years old. He is an old man. He takes 2 servants with him. They have a donkey. They have the wood. They have Isaac. And notice here in verse 6, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. Isaac is carrying the wood on his back. And Abraham has the fire in one hand and he has the knife in the other. And it says there, and the two of them went together, walking side by side, father and son. And father is about to take his son's life. The second thing I want you to see here today is the observation. Notice what happens here in verse 7. And Isaac speaks up to Abraham. And this is heartbreaking. He says, Dad? Father? And he said, Here I am, son. I'm right with you. And he says, look, the fire and the wood. But where's the lamb? Where's the lamb? I don't see the sacrifice. I see that you're ready to sacrifice. I see that we have the wood and you have the fire in your hand and you have a knife in your hand and we're walking and it's just you and me, but where is the lamb? And this is what Abraham says. Abraham says, my son, God will provide. I don't know your journey of faith. I haven't known you that long. I don't know where you come from. I don't know what you think about God. I don't know when you were saved. But I want you to know this morning that this is an eternal and timeless truth that God will provide. God will provide the sacrifice. Abraham did not know. Abraham had no idea. He is following God's instructions. He doesn't know how God will work it out. He doesn't know how this thing is going to turn out. It makes no sense to him. Why would He give me this son, but then tell me to take this son and offer him as a burnt offering? But Abraham was faithful. And this is what he believed about God. That when things don't make sense, that God will provide. You may be faced with a question of salvation. You may be faced with how in the world am I to see God and to spend eternity with God? How am I ever, in my own power, in my sinfulness, in my dirty heart, able to stand in the presence of God? Here's the answer. God will provide. A third thing I want you to see this morning is the intervention. Notice here in verse 9. Well, did you see that again at the end of verse 8? He says it twice. In fact, he says it 3 times in the text. So the two of them went on together. He said it there when they departed from the camp and they left the servants behind. So the two of them went on together. After Isaac asked, where's the lamb? Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham said, God's going to provide. Don't worry about it, son. And the two of them went on together. They keep on journeying and they're going towards this mountain. He's going to the mountain that God told him to. And notice here in verse 9, this intervention. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there, and he placed the wood in order, and he tied up Isaac, his son. Can you imagine that moment? Abraham could have come along and taken Isaac by surprise and stabbed him in the side. He could have walked up and said, hey, you've got something on your neck, and he could have slit his throat there. But he doesn't. He takes the time and he ties Isaac up. He binds his feet. he binds his hands, and they prepare the sacrifice. And they prepare the altar for sacrifice. And it says there, Abraham built an altar. He bound Isaac. He laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham, no doubt, knife in one hand. I don't know if he was right-handed or left-handed. Knife in one hand, and with the other hand, he pulls Isaac's chin up, just like you would a lamb that's on the altar. And he pulls it back. And as he lifts the knife into the air, about to slay Isaac, God shows up again. God just keeps showing up in Abraham's life. Even when he makes mistakes, God shows up in his life. When he's obedient, God shows up in his life. When he's out of answers and he's gotten to the end of every option that he knows, when he's exhausted all things, God shows up in his life. And notice what happens. It is an angel of the Lord, in verse 11, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he says, do not lay your hand on that boy. And don't do anything to him. Look at this. This is key. For now I know. You see that? It isn't that God didn't know before. But remember, this is a test. And God had put him to the test and wanted to know, is he willing to love the Lord thy God with all his heart and with all thy soul above everything else? Is he willing to put everything else aside and put God first in his life? And God says, now I know. And that's what he says. He says that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And here we go. Abraham told the men, he said, I'm going to come back. We're going to go worship, and we're going to come back. He said, we're going to come back. And when Isaac asked the question, where's the lamb? He said, God will provide. And he looks up after he is willing to go all the way up to the point of lifting the knife in the air. Notice what it says in here in verse 13. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked. You know, he said that while ago. On the third day, he lifts up his eyes and he sees the place where God had told him to go. It's just another snapshot of Abraham's faith. And now he looks up and he sees a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. I want to stop right here for just a second, and I want you to think about this. Is that in your life, you're going to be challenged at times. Your faith is going to be put to the test. But I want you to know that when you have your eyes fully trusting on God, just like Abraham did here, and he goes to the place, he follows God, and he goes to that place where God had said to go, the Lord will provide there. God's not going to take you to a place where he doesn't have an answer to give you when you get there. And he says the Lord will provide. That's what he names the place. And notice here in verses 15 through 18, we have this culminating reaffirmation of the previous promises. If you're not aware of the story of Abraham, go back and start at Genesis chapter 12 and read all the way, and you're going to see pieces and tidbits of what is said here in verses 15 through 18. But 15 through 18 is the most comprehensive and complete of this promise. Listen to it very carefully. It says, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time. Not only does he intervene and say stop, because what would be the point of the test if Abraham sets out and then Isaac comes back? with him. There's a purpose behind the test. And he says, I know that you fear God. And here's the second thing I want you to know here, is that by myself I have sworn. And this is God making an oath on himself. There's nothing greater, and this is what Hebrews chapter 6 talks about when it says that God made an oath on himself. He says, by myself I have sworn, because there's nothing greater for God to swear upon than himself. In other words, it goes down to God's character, that you can depend on God and listen to God and believe that what God says is true. And he says, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Look at verse 17. Blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. And here they are again going on together in verse 19. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose, and there it is, went together to Beersheba. They make a full circle. They started at Beersheba, and they come back to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. I want to leave you with a couple of things as we come to a close. First thing is this. Did you notice, and I think you did, that Abraham in this test is completely torn apart? He's torn between the faith in the divine promises. Faith in the divine promises concerning Isaac. He was told that Isaac would be the heir of the promise. And he was torn between believing that versus now God has told him something else. It looks like a no-win situation. How can I believe that in these divine promises on one hand that Isaac is going to be the heir of the promise, and now God is telling me to take his life? How would these divine promises ever come about? But God doesn't argue, Abraham doesn't argue, does he? Abraham doesn't look at God and begin to question God. That's a good place to say something right now. Is that we should never put God to the test. God is the one who is in the position of putting us to the test. Who in the world do we think we are to question God? And Abraham did not question God, did he? Although he was torn, although he was conflicted, he went on and he was obedient to God. And the second thing there is he's obviously conflicted with this. His love for his son, Isaac, the natural, biological affection for his little boy, who he has waited on for so many years, all the way to his 100 years old, versus his love for God. In your life, there's going to be a time, if there hasn't already been a time, you're going to find yourself in a similar situation as Abraham. You may not be told to sacrifice your own child, but you're going to find yourself in a situation where doesn't seem to be any good options. And there's one of three things that you're going to do. You might say, I'm done with this. There is no God. Don't do that. You might start thinking that, though. There is no God. This doesn't make sense. This can't be. Or, like most people and a lot of people, you may take the second option, and it is this, is that God doesn't care about me. God doesn't love me. Or the third thing you should do, like Abraham, is this. I'm going to trust Him. I'm going to trust Him like Abraham did, even though I don't have a clue how He's going to work this thing out. You come to the end of your rope and you come to the point to where it doesn't make any sense. I want you to know this too. Everyone can expect their faith to be tested. The question is what will it show? And this is what the test is about. Are you, like Abraham, willing to put obedience to God above everything else in your life? Are you going to put God first in your life? That's the test. That is the definition of your faith being tested. What is important to you? What do you love? What is this thing? Is it commitment when the times are easy? Is it commitment when everything seems just to be falling into place? Don't you love that? We do, don't we? And unfortunately, sometimes that's how we discern the will of God, is that when everything just seems to fall into place. Have you heard people say that? Oh, we did this, and God will work that way sometimes, but He doesn't always have to work that way just to make you happy. Sometimes it may be difficult. Sometimes you may not be able to understand how He's going to work things out. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. God has always provided the sacrifice. I know I said it a while ago. I don't know who in the world we think we are sometimes. Done lost our minds to think that you have ever brought anything to God that will make Him happy. Who in the world do we think we are? I'm going to tell you the only thing that satisfies God is the blood of Jesus. And I'm going to tell you who gave and provided that sacrifice. It was God Himself. And so when you come and you stand before God and you say, God, what can I bring you? What can I bring you that will satisfy and make atonement for my sins? Well, dear friend, it's something that God has already provided. He's provided His Son. It's Jesus. Even in the Old Testament, before Jesus, those sacrifices, the sheep, the ram, and the bull, and the goats, and the dove, and on and on and on, all the sacrifices that God said to bring, all those were provided by God too. The picture here is not what you can do for God, but the picture here is, are you going to be obedient to see what God has provided for you? It's your faith being tested. The last thing I want to tell you is this. Did you notice the picture here that moves forward all the way up till today? Did you see it? It has something to do with Jesus. But back up just a little bit. You can back up all the way back to the Exodus. And that night, it was night. You remember that? That last night in Egypt. God told the people of Israel to take a lamb and kill that lamb and take the blood of that lamb and put it on their doorposts. You remember that? That was the last night in Egypt. And what happened there on that night is that God said, I'm going to send a death angel. And he's going to go over all these places and all these homes. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. But where the blood was not found, what happened? The firstborn was taken. In other words, this is the picture here. The picture is that God provided a way for the redemption of every firstborn male in the land of Egypt when they have a sacrifice that is acceptable to God. He says, take that sacrifice, and that sacrifice will redeem the firstborn of every household. Did you see what God provided in the story today? God provided a ram. He provided a sacrifice to redeem Isaac. I want you to stand this morning. I want us to have a song of invitation. And let me close with this. On into the New Testament. There's a couple of things I want to show you. First of all, it's this, is that Christ is our Passover. Christ is that lamb that will not just redeem the firstborn. It is more expansive than that. Did you hear the promises that God gave to Abraham? The whole world is going to be affected by these promises to Abraham. Now, back to your faith being tested. Over in the book of James, James writes by inspiration here in chapter 2, and I'm going to read a couple of verses to you. Verse 21 and 22 of James 2 says this, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works his faith was made perfect? You say, I don't understand these trials, and I don't understand these tests that God puts us through with our faith. Well, here is the answer. James gives us the answer. It is to make your faith stronger and more complete, to bring it to full maturity. When you get to the end of your life and you stand before God, you will be able to stand before God and say, you know what, I brought the sacrifice that you have provided. This is what you have provided. I'm covered by the blood. And in all things, I believed you, I loved you, I followed you, even when it was hard and difficult. I'm going to show you one more thing about faith and Abraham's faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, he offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding, and this tells us why. Why in the world would Abraham do such a thing? How could he do such a thing? How could he believe God? Well, this is how. Abraham concluded that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Dear friend, Jesus has been raised from the dead. And no matter what God says, we are to do it, and that is what our faith is all about. There was a close look at Abraham's faith here, wasn't there? And Abraham didn't understand it, but he said, you know what? Somehow, some way, God will work this thing out. As we sing, I want you to think about this. As we